Close your eyes and imagine a world wrapped in smoke and shadow, where kingdoms crumble beneath the weight of war and the cries of soldiers fade into the twilight. In the heart of medieval France, while battles raged and hope withered like autumn leaves, a young girl stood in a quiet garden, listening to voices no one else could hear. She was not a queen, nor a warrior born to armor and sword. She was a shepherd's daughter, barefoot in the fields, her hands rough from wool and soil. Yet within her chest burned something the kings and generals had long forgotten, a belief so fierce, so pure, that it would carry her from the pastures of Domremy to the throne rooms of power, and finally to the flames that would consume her body but never her name. Tonight, as the world outside grows still and the stars take their places in the velvet sky, let us walk beside her. Let us trace the footsteps of a girl who heard the voice of heaven, who led an army, who crowned a king, and who died with grace even as the world watched her burn. This is the story of Joan of Arc, a tragedy woven with courage, betrayal, and a light that still flickers centuries later in the quiet moments before sleep. If these words carry you closer to rest, if this story becomes a companion in the quiet hours, let this channel stay by your side too. A gentle subscribe, a soft like, it's a small kindness that helps these voices continue, night after night, bringing history to those who seek comfort in the past. Now, settle in. Let the world fall away, and let Joan's story begin. In the year 1412, as winter loosened its grip on the countryside and the first green shoots pressed through the thawing earth, a child was born in the village of Domremy. It was a place so small it barely appeared on maps, a cluster of stone cottages nestled in the valley of the Meuse River, where the forests grew thick and the church bells carried across the fields like prayers made audible. The girl was named Joan, in the language that would one day speak her name across continents and centuries. She arrived into a world that had long forgotten peace, a world where war was not an event but a condition, as constant as the changing seasons. The 100 Years' War, they would call it later, though to those living through it, time had lost all meaning. There was only the war and the waiting and the quiet terror that came with both. Joan's father was Jacques d'Arc, a farmer of modest means, a man whose hands were calloused from the plow and whose face was weathered by sun and worry. Her mother, Isabelle Romy, was a woman of deep faith, the kind who knelt in prayer not out of habit but out of necessity, seeking comfort in a world that offered little. They were not wealthy, but they were not destitute either. They had land enough to feed their family, a roof that kept out most of the rain, and the respect of their neighbors. Joan grew up among 4 siblings, the youngest daughter in a household where work began at dawn and ended only when the light failed. She learned to spin wool, to tend the animals, to move through her days with the quiet efficiency expected of a girl born to labor. But even as a child, there was something about her that set her apart, not in any grand or obvious way, but in the quality of her attention, the depth of her stillness when she prayed. Domremy was a village caught between 2 worlds. Officially, it belonged to the French crown, loyal to the Dauphin Charles, the uncrowned king who lived in exile while the English occupied Paris and claimed France as their own. But the region was a patchwork of allegiances, with some villages siding with the Burgundians who had allied themselves with England and others clinging to the French cause. Joan's village was French in its heart, but that loyalty came with a price. Raids were common. Soldiers from both sides would sweep through, taking what they wanted: livestock, grain, sometimes women, and leaving behind only ash and grief. Joan grew up with the knowledge that safety was an illusion, that at any moment the war might arrive at her doorstep, and there would be nothing she could do but hide and pray that the violence would pass her by. The church stood at the center of village life, both literally and spiritually. It was a modest building, stone and timber, with a bell tower that rose above the rooftops like a sentinel. Joan went there often, more often than her chores strictly allowed. She would slip away when she could, drawn by something she could not name, and kneel in the dim interior where the air smelled of incense and old wood. She prayed with an intensity that puzzled even her mother, who was herself devout. Other children played and quarreled and dreamed of nothing more than the next meal or the next festival. But Joan seemed to exist in a different space, as though part of her was always listening for something just beyond the reach of ordinary hearing. She loved the saints, especially Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, whose stories of faith and martyrdom stirred something fierce and tender in her young heart. She loved the rituals, the rhythm of the liturgy, the way the light fell through the narrow windows and made the dust motes dance like tiny souls ascending. But it was not all prayer and solemnity. Joan was, in many ways, an ordinary girl. She laughed with her siblings, helped her mother bake bread, ran through the fields with the village children, her skirts hiked up and her feet bare against the cool grass. She was strong for her age, not delicate or frail, and she could work as hard as any boy. Her brothers teased her sometimes, called her too serious, too pious, but there was affection in their teasing. She was loved, and she knew it. The village embraced her as one of their own, a good girl, a dutiful daughter, someone who would grow up to marry a local boy, bear children, and live out her days in the same quiet rhythm as her mother and grandmother before her. That was the future that lay before her, certain and unremarkable, and no one, least of all Joan herself, had any reason to imagine otherwise. And yet, even in those early years, there were moments, small things easy to dismiss. Joan would sometimes pause in the middle of a task, her head tilted as though listening to a voice no one else could hear. She would stand in the garden, perfectly still, her eyes unfocused, and when asked what she was doing, she would simply smile and say she was thinking. Her mother noticed, but did not worry. Children were often lost in their own worlds. It was part of growing up, this dreaming, this drifting. It would pass, Isabel thought, as all childish things eventually pass. But it did not pass. Instead, it grew deeper, quieter, more insistent, like a seed buried in dark soil, waiting for the right moment to break through into the light. When Joan reached the age of 13, the voices began in earnest. It was summer, the kind of day when the heat shimmered over the fields, and the air itself seemed to hum with drowsy contentment. She was in her father's garden, alone, tending to the vegetables that grew in neat rows behind the house. The sun was high, the world was quiet, and then suddenly it was not. A light appeared before her, brighter than anything she had ever seen, yet it did not hurt her eyes. It was warm, almost tender, and with the light came a voice clear, resonant, filled with authority and gentleness all at once. The voice told her to be good, to attend church faithfully, to live with piety and devotion. It did not tell her who it was, not at first, and Joan was too frightened to ask. She stood frozen, her hands still clutching the weeds she had been pulling, her heart hammering in her chest. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the light faded and she was alone again. standing in the garden with the sun on her shoulders and the smell of earth in her nostrils. She did not speak of it. Not to her mother, not to her father, not to the priest. She feared they would think her mad, or worse, possessed. In an age when the church held dominion over every aspect of life, when heresy was punished with fire and suspicion could destroy a family, silence seemed the safest choice. But the voice returned. Again and again, it came to her, always accompanied by that radiant light, always gentle but insistent. Over time, the voice began to identify itself. It was Saint Michael, it said, the archangel, warrior of heaven, protector of France. He came not to frighten her, but to prepare her. He told her that she had been chosen for a great task, that God had seen her faithfulness and found her worthy. And he was not alone. Soon, other voices joined his Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, the martyred saints Joan had loved since childhood. They spoke to her with maternal warmth, encouraging her, guiding her, telling her that she must be brave, that she must trust in God's plan even when it made no earthly sense. Joan listened, and slowly she began to believe. The voices told her things she could not have known on her own prophecies about the war, about the fate of France, about the Dauphin who languished in exile while the English tightened their grip on the kingdom. They told her that she, Joan, would be the one to change everything. She would drive the English from French soil. She would see the Dauphin crowned king in Reims, the traditional seat of coronation. She would restore France to its rightful glory. It was impossible, of course. She was a peasant girl, illiterate, untrained in warfare, with no connections to power or nobility. She had never even held a sword. But the voices did not waver, and neither, eventually, did she. She prayed for guidance, for confirmation, for the strength to accept what was being asked of her. And in the stillness of those prayers, she felt a certainty settle over her like a cloak, heavy, but also warm. This was her purpose. This was why she had been born. But knowing her purpose and fulfilling it were two entirely different things. Joan continued her daily life, spinning and sewing and tending the animals, but inside she was changing. Her family noticed. She became even more withdrawn, more serious, spending hours in prayer when she should have been working. Her father, worried, began to have dark dreams about his daughter. He dreamed she ran away with soldiers, that she brought shame upon the family. He told her brothers to watch her, to keep her close, and he swore that if she ever did such a thing, he would drown her with his own hands rather than see the family dishonored. Jacques d'Arc was not a cruel man, but he was a man of his time, and honor mattered more than almost anything. Joan heard his words and said nothing. She knew that when the time came, she would have to leave, and her father's anger would be one more burden she would have to carry. The war, meanwhile, crept ever closer. When Joan was 16, Domremy itself was raided by Burgundian forces. The villagers fled to a nearby fortified town, taking what they could carry and leaving the rest to the mercy of soldiers who had no mercy to give. Joan and her family huddled with the others, listening to the distant sounds of looting and destruction, praying that their home would still be standing when they returned. It was, though others were not so fortunate. The raid was a reminder that neutrality was a luxury no one could afford. The war was everywhere, and it devoured everything in its path. Joan saw the faces of her neighbors, hollow-eyed, exhausted, afraid, and she felt the weight of her mission pressed down harder. France was dying. Her people were suffering, and she was being called to do something about it. By the time Joan turned 17, the voices had grown urgent. They told her the time was near, that she could wait no longer. The city of Orleans was under siege, they said, and if it fell, France would fall with it. She had to go to the Dauphin, had to convince him to give her an army, had to act before it was too late. Joan knew what this meant. She would have to leave her family, leave the only home she had ever known, and walk into a world that would mock her, doubt her, perhaps destroy her. She would have to stand before men of power and tell them that God had sent her, a girl with no education and no pedigree, to save the kingdom. It was madness. It was terrifying. But the voices did not offer her a choice, and in her heart, she did not want one. She had been called, and she would answer. That was all there was to it. One evening, as the light faded and the village settled into its nightly quiet, Joan sat with her mother by the fire. Isabel was mending a shirt, her needle moving with the practiced ease of decades. Joan watched her, memorizing the curve of her mother's shoulders, the way the firelight caught in her graying hair. She wanted to tell her everything about the voices, about the mission, about the fact that soon, very soon, she would have to leave. But the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain something she barely understood herself? How could she ask her mother to let her go, knowing it might be the last time they ever saw each other? So she said nothing. She simply sat and watched, and let the warmth of the fire and her mother's presence wrap around her like a blessing she knew she did not deserve to keep. The decision, once made in her heart, could not be unmade. Joan began to prepare herself in the only ways she knew how. She prayed with even greater fervor, sometimes disappearing into the church for hours at a time. Her knees pressed against the cold stone floor until they ached. She sought clarity, sought courage, sought some sign that she was not simply losing her mind. The voices reassured her, patient and steady as always. They told her exactly what she must do. First, she would need to travel to Vaucouleurs, a nearby garrison town loyal to the Dauphin, where a captain named Robert de Baudricourt commanded the local forces. She would tell him of her mission, and he would provide her with an escort to Chinon, where the Dauphin kept his court. It sounded simple when the voices explained it, almost easy, but Joan knew better. Baudricourt was a soldier, a practical man who dealt in steel and strategy, not in visions and prophecy. Convincing him would be the first of many impossible tasks. In the spring of 1428, Joan finally made her move. She told her parents she was going to visit her cousin Durand Laxart, who lived in a village near Vaucouleurs, and that she would help his wife with a new baby. It was not entirely a lie she did visit her cousin, but it was not the whole truth either. Joan had learned that sometimes to follow God's will, one had to move quietly, carefully, revealing only what was necessary. Her parents let her go without suspicion. She was 17, sensible, devout. What harm could come from helping family? They embraced her, wished her well, and she walked away from her home with a bundle of clothes and a heart that felt too large for her chest. She did not look back. She feared that if she did, her resolve would crumble, and she would run back to the safety of her mother's arms and never leave again. Durand Laxart was a kind man, simple and honest, and when Joan told him what she needed, an escort to Vaucouleurs, an introduction to Baudricourt, he stared at her as though she had sprouted wings. She explained, as best she could, about the voices, about the mission, about the urgency of reaching the Dauphin before Orleans fell. Durand listened, his weathered face creased with worry and confusion. He did not understand, not really, but he saw something in his young cousin that gave him pause. There was a light in her eyes, a certainty that seemed almost otherworldly. Against his better judgment, against every instinct that told him this was foolishness, he agreed to help her. He took her to Vaucouleurs, and together they sought an audience with Robert de Baudricourt. The captain was everything Joan had feared he would be. He was older, hardened by years of war, with the weary cynicism of a man who had seen too much death and too many false promises. When Joan stood before him in the dim hall of his fortress and announced that she had been sent by God to save France, to drive out the English and crown the Dauphin king, he laughed. It was not a cruel laugh, exactly, but it was dismissive, the kind of laugh reserved for children who say foolish things. He told Durand to take his cousin home, to give her a good slap if necessary, and to stop wasting his time with such nonsense. Joan tried to argue, tried to explain, but Baudricourt waved her away. He had battles to plan, soldiers to feed, real problems that required real solutions. He had no patience for peasant girls and their delusions of grandeur. Joan left the fortress with her head held high, though inside her heart was breaking. She had been so certain, so sure that once she spoke, people would listen, would believe. But the world did not work that way. Faith, she was learning, was not contagious. It could not be transferred simply by speaking it aloud. She returned to her cousin's home, and for several days she did nothing but pray. She asked the voices if she had misunderstood, if perhaps this was not her path after all. But they were as clear as ever. She must try again. She must persist. Baudricourt would come around, they promised, but only if she refused to give up. And so she tried again. She returned to Vaucouleurs, sought another audience, and once more stood before the captain with her impossible request. This time she did not speak of visions and saints. Instead, she spoke of Orleans, of the Dauphin's desperate situation, of the fact that France was on the brink of collapse and something, anything, had to be done. She spoke with such conviction, such clarity, that Baudricourt found himself listening despite himself. She also made a prediction. She told him of a military defeat that the French forces would suffer near Orleans, a defeat that had not yet happened, but that the voices had revealed to her. Baudricourt dismissed her again, but he did not forget her words. And when, days later, news arrived of the exact defeat Joan had described, he began to wonder. Perhaps she was mad. Or perhaps, just perhaps, she was something else entirely. Word of the strange girl from Domremy began to spread through Vaucouleurs. Common people came to see her, drawn by curiosity and the desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she was what she claimed to be. They were tired of losing, tired of suffering, tired of watching their country bleed. If God had truly sent someone to help them, who were they to turn that person away? Joan stayed in the town for weeks, living with a wheelwright and his wife, spending her days in prayer and her evenings speaking with anyone who would listen. She did not preach or demand. She simply told her story again and again, with patience and grace. And slowly, people began to believe. Not everyone, and not completely, but enough. Enough that when she went to Baudricourt for the third time, she did not go alone. She went with the support of the townspeople, with their voices added to hers, a chorus of hope rising from the ashes of despair. This time, Baudricourt did not laugh. He looked at Joan, at her calm face, her steady eyes, the strange quiet strength that seemed to radiate from her, and he made a decision that would alter the course of history. He agreed to send her to the Dauphin. He gave her a horse, an escort of 6 men, and a letter of introduction. He also gave her a sword, though she would later refuse to use it for violence. Before she left, he had her examined by a priest to ensure she was not possessed or in league with demons. The priest found nothing wrong, nothing dark. She was, by all accounts, a normal girl, except for the fact that she claimed to hear the voices of saints and believed with absolute certainty that she was meant to save France. On February 23, 1429, Joan left Vaucouleurs and began the long, dangerous journey to Chinon. She cut her hair short, dressed in men's clothing for safety, and rode out into a country torn apart by war. Behind her, the people of Vaucouleurs watched her go, some praying, some weeping, all of them wondering if they had just witnessed the beginning of a miracle or the tragic end of a brave, foolish girl. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, filled with enemies and obstacles she could not yet imagine. But Joan did not look back. She had heard the voice of heaven, and she would follow it wherever it led, even if it led her to the very edge of the world. The journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon was nearly 300 miles, a distance that in peaceful times might have taken a week or two of steady travel. But these were not peaceful times. The roads were treacherous, controlled in patches by English and Burgundian forces, haunted by bandits who cared nothing for allegiances and everything for profit. Rivers had to be forded, forests navigated, towns avoided or passed through under cover of darkness. Joan and her small escort 6 men, some skeptical, some cautiously hopeful, moved like ghosts through a landscape scarred by decades of war. They traveled mostly at night, their horses' hooves muffled against the frozen ground, their breath rising in pale clouds beneath a winter sky that seemed to press down upon them with the weight of all the suffering below. Joan did not complain. She did not falter. She rode with a calm that unnerved even the most experienced soldiers in her company. When they asked her if she was afraid, she told them simply that God was with her, and that was all the protection she needed. The men who accompanied her were rough, hardened by years of combat, the kind who had seen too much death to believe in miracles. Yet something about Joan gave them pause. She did not behave like other women they had known. She did not flirt or seek their approval. She did not complain about the cold, the hunger, the endless hours in the saddle. She prayed constantly, her lips moving in silent conversation with forces they could not see. And when she spoke to them, it was with a gentleness that felt strangely out of place in the brutality of their world. One of the men, Jean de Metz, later said that from the moment he met her, he felt compelled to serve her as though some invisible hand had placed the desire in his heart. Another, Bertrand de Polangy, admitted that he did not understand what she was or what she was meant to do, but he knew, somehow, that she was important. They protected her fiercely, these soldiers, not because they had been ordered to, but because they wanted to. Because in her presence, they felt something they had almost forgotten: hope. Joan spoke to them about the voices during those long nights on the road. She told them about Saint Michael, who had appeared to her first, his presence so commanding that she had fallen to her knees in awe. She described how he had instructed her in the ways of faith, how he had told her to be pure, to remain chaste, to devote herself wholly to God's purpose. She spoke of Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret, who came to her with maternal tenderness, who counseled her when she was afraid, who reminded her that she was not alone. The voices, she said, were as real to her as the men sitting beside the fire, as real as the stars overhead. They spoke in French, she told them, their words clear and unmistakable. They did not riddle or confuse. They gave her specific instructions: go to the Dauphin, raise the siege of Orleans, see him crowned in Reims, and they promised her that if she obeyed, if she kept faith, God would work miracles through her. The soldiers did not know what to make of this. Some thought she might be deluded, a girl who had spent too much time alone with her prayers and had lost the ability to separate divine inspiration from her own imagination. Others wondered if she might be something darker, a witch, a deceiver sent by the devil to lead them astray. But as the days passed and they saw how she conducted herself, those fears began to fade. She attended Mass whenever they passed through a friendly town. She confessed her sins, took communion, lived with a piety that seemed incapable of deception. She never asked for special treatment, never demanded comfort or privilege. She ate the same meager rations they did, slept on the same cold ground, and when danger threatened, she did not hide behind them, but rode at their side, trusting that God would see them safely through. Slowly, reluctantly, the men began to believe that whatever Joan was, she was not a fraud. She was either mad or touched by the divine, and either way, she was worth following. They reached Chinon on March 6, 1429, after 11 grueling days on the road. The castle loomed above the town, a massive fortress perched on a hill, its walls blackened by time and weather, its towers piercing the gray sky like accusing fingers. Inside those walls lived Charles VII, the man who should have been king but who wore no crown, who commanded an army but inspired little loyalty, who was mired in indecision and surrounded by advisors who spent more time scheming against each other than fighting the English. Joan looked up at the castle, and for the first time since leaving Domremy, she felt a flicker of doubt. Not about her mission, never about that, but about whether she could truly convince a king, a man born to power and politics, to listen to a peasant girl who claimed to speak for God. The voices reassured her, as they always did. They told her that Charles would recognize her, that he would know she had been sent to him, and that he would give her what she needed. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to walk into the hall where her destiny would be decided. But first, she had to wait. Days passed before she was granted an audience. The Dauphin's court was a labyrinth of protocol and suspicion, where every decision was debated endlessly and nothing happened quickly. Joan stayed in the town, lodging with a family who took pity on her and spent her time in prayer. She could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her, curious, skeptical, hungry for something to believe in. Rumors spread quickly. There was a girl who claimed to be sent by God, a virgin warrior who would save France. Some mocked her. Others came to her with quiet desperation, asking for blessings, for prayers, for any sign that their suffering might finally end. Joan treated them all with kindness. She did not claim to be a saint or a prophet. She was simply a messenger, she told them, and the message was this: God had not forgotten France. Finally, on the evening of March 9th, Joan was summoned to the castle. She was brought into the great hall, a vast chamber lit by torches and filled with nobles dressed in rich velvets and furs, their faces painted with curiosity and disdain. Charles had decided to test her. He hid himself among his courtiers, placing another man on the throne to see if Joan would be fooled. It was a game, a trick, the kind of petty deception that men of power used to amuse themselves. But Joan walked into that hall with her head high and her gaze steady, and she did not even glance at the man on the throne. She moved through the crowd as though guided by an invisible hand, and she stopped before a young man standing near the back, a man with a weak chin and tired eyes, a man who looked more like a defeated merchant than a king. She knelt before him, and in a voice that carried across the silent hall, she said, "Gentle Dauphin, I am Joan the maid, sent by God to bring you aid." The hall fell silent. Every eye turned toward the young man Joan had knelt before, and in that silence, something extraordinary unfolded. Charles stared down at her, his expression shifting from confusion to astonishment. He had expected to fool her, to expose her as a charlatan or a madman's puppet, but instead, she had identified him instantly, effortlessly, as though the very hand of God had pointed him out. He stammered, denied at first that he was the Dauphin, but Joan smiled gently and insisted. She rose to her feet and asked if they might speak in private, away from the watching eyes and listening ears of the court. Charles hesitated. His advisors murmured warnings, suspicious of this strange girl who dressed like a boy and spoke with unsettling confidence. But something in Joan's gaze, calm, certain, fearless, compelled him to agree. He led her to a private chamber, and there, with only a few trusted men nearby, Joan spoke words that would change his life forever. What she said in that room has never been fully revealed. Joan kept the secret, and Charles never spoke of it publicly. But witnesses who stood close enough to observe said that the Dauphin's face transformed as she spoke. The weariness lifted from his eyes. The doubt that had haunted him for years seemed to dissolve. Some historians believe Joan revealed a private prayer Charles had once made, a desperate plea to God that no one else could have known. Others suggest she confirmed his legitimacy, addressing the rumors that had plagued him since childhood, whispers that he was not truly his father's son, that his mother had betrayed the crown, that he had no right to rule. Whatever Joan said, it struck at the very heart of Charles's deepest fears and most secret hopes. When they emerged from the chamber, the Dauphin was no longer skeptical. He was convinced. This girl, this impossible, unlikely messenger, had been sent to him by God. He did not understand how or why, but he believed it with a certainty he had not felt about anything in years. Still, belief was not enough. Charles was surrounded by cautious men, clergymen and advisors who demanded proof before they would allow a peasant girl to influence the fate of the kingdom. They insisted Joan be examined, tested, her claims scrutinized by theologians and scholars. For 3 weeks, she was sent to Poitiers, where a commission of doctors, priests, and learned men questioned her relentlessly. They asked her about the voices, about her visions, about her faith and her intentions. They tried to trap her with complex theological questions to expose her as ignorant or heretical. But Joan answered with a simplicity that confounded them. When they asked for a sign to prove she was sent by God, she told them plainly that the sign would be the raising of the siege at Orleans. When they questioned her purity, she submitted to an examination by noble women who confirmed she was indeed a virgin, untouched, as she claimed. When they pressed her on matters of doctrine, she deferred humbly to the church, but never wavered in her insistence that her voices came from heaven. The men of Poitiers found themselves in an impossible position. They could find no fault in her. She was pious, humble, obedient to the church, and utterly sincere. Yet what she claimed was so extraordinary, so far beyond the boundaries of ordinary experience, that accepting it required a leap of faith most of them were reluctant to make. In the end, they concluded cautiously that while they could not prove her voices were divine, they could find no evidence they were demonic either. Given the desperate state of France, given that conventional strategies had all failed, perhaps it was worth allowing her to try. It was a tepid endorsement, born more of desperation than conviction, but it was enough. Joan was permitted to return to Chinon, and Charles, bolstered by the Commission's reluctant approval, began to prepare her for the mission she had traveled so far to undertake. Joan was given armor, white and gleaming, fitted to her small frame. She was given a banner, stitched with the names of Jesus and Mary, and emblazoned with an image of Christ in judgment. She did not ask for a sword meant for killing, though one was offered. Instead, she requested a specific blade and ancient sword that, according to her voices, lay buried behind the altar of the Church of St. Catherine de Fireboy. Messengers were sent, skeptical but obedient, and they found the sword exactly where Joan had said it would be, covered in rust but still whole. When it was brought to her, the rust fell away with barely a touch, and the blade gleamed as though it had been waiting for her all along. It was a small miracle, easily dismissed by cynics as coincidence, but to those who witnessed it, it felt like confirmation. Joan carried that sword not as a weapon, but as a symbol, a sign that heaven truly walked with her. As preparations continued, Joan's presence began to ripple outward through the army and the common people. Soldiers who had fought for years without hope, who had watched their comrades die in pointless skirmishes and seen their country carved apart by foreign invaders, suddenly found themselves stirred by something they could not name. This girl, barely more than a child, spoke with such conviction about God's plan for France that even the most hardened veterans felt a spark reignite in their chests. She did not promise them easy victory. She did not sugarcoat the dangers ahead. But she told them they were not alone, that heaven was on their side, and that if they fought with courage and faith, they would prevail. It was a message the people of France had been starving to hear. Recruitment surged. Men who had deserted returned to the ranks. The army, once demoralized and fragmented, began to coalesce around this strange, shining figure in white armor. Joan imposed strict rules on the soldiers. She would not tolerate blasphemy, looting, or the abuse of women. She insisted the men attend Mass, confess their sins, and conduct themselves with honor. Some grumbled at these demands, unaccustomed to such discipline, but most obeyed. There was something about Joan that made disobedience feel impossible. She did not shout or threaten. She simply expected goodness, and in her presence, men found themselves wanting to live up to that expectation. Priests who traveled with the army noted that attendance at confession rose dramatically. Soldiers who had lived like animals, hardened by years of violence, began to weep during prayers. It was as though Joan's faith was contagious, spreading through the ranks like a cleansing fire, burning away cynicism and despair and leaving behind something raw and powerful hope. Yes, but also a fierce, protective love for the girl who had brought it to them. The voices continued to speak to Joan throughout this time. They guided her decisions, reassured her when doubt crept in, reminded her that her mission was not yet complete. She spoke of them openly, without shame or hesitation, and though some still thought her mad, most had come to accept that whatever the source of her certainty, it was real to her, and it was working. France, which had been dying slowly for decades, was waking up, The impossible was becoming possible. And at the center of it all stood Joan, a 17-year-old girl who should have been tending sheep in Domremy, but who instead was about to lead an army into battle against the most powerful military force in Europe. She did not feel like a hero. She felt like a servant, doing what she had been commanded to do, following the voices that had never once led her astray. And as the army prepared to march toward Orleans, as the banners were raised and the soldiers sang hymns into the spring air, Joan closed her eyes and listened one more time to the voices that had brought her this far, trusting that they would carry her through whatever lay ahead. The voices had grown more urgent now, their tone edged with a solemnity that Joan had not heard before. They told her that Orleans was the key, the hinge upon which the fate of France would turn. If the city fell, the English would have an open path to the heart of the kingdom, and the Dauphin's cause would collapse into dust and memory. But if Orleans could be saved, if the siege could be broken, it would be a sign, not just to France, but to all of Europe, that God had not abandoned his people. The weight of this knowledge pressed upon Joan's shoulders like a physical thing, heavy and inescapable. She was not a general. She had never studied warfare or strategy. She had never even seen a real battle. Yet here she was, preparing to ride at the head of an army, entrusted with a mission that seasoned commanders had deemed impossible. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it were not so desperately real. As the army assembled, Joan found herself surrounded by men who had spent their entire lives in service to war. There was Jeanne d'Aulon, a seasoned knight assigned as her steward, who watched over her with a mixture of protectiveness and bewilderment. There was the Duke of Alencon, a young nobleman who had recently been released from English captivity and who saw in Joan something that rekindled his own battered faith. There was La Hire, a notorious warrior known for his ferocity and his foul mouth, who swore less in Joan's presence and found himself, to his own surprise, attending Mass regularly. These men and hundreds of others looked to her for guidance, for inspiration, for something they could not articulate but desperately needed. And Joan, who had grown up knowing nothing of command, found that the voices gave her what she lacked. They told her when to advance, when to wait, when to speak, and when to remain silent. They became her counsel, her strategy, her invisible generals. Before the army departed for Orleans, Joan dictated a letter to the English commanders besieging the city. She could not write herself, she had never been taught, but she spoke the words, and a scribe captured them on parchment. The letter was astonishing in its boldness. She addressed the English king, the regent Bedford, and the commanders in the field, and she demanded, in the name of the King of Heaven, that they abandon the siege and return to their own lands. She called them invaders, trespassers on French soil, and warned them that if they did not withdraw, they would face the wrath of God. She signed it not with her own hand, but with the title the voices had given her, Jehan la Pucelle, Joan the Maid. When the letter was read aloud to the English forces, they responded with mockery and rage. They called her a witch, a whore, a peasant playing at prophecy. They said they would burn her when they caught her, that they would make an example of her arrogance. But beneath the mockery, there was something else, a flicker of unease. Because while they did not believe in her voices, they could not ignore the fact that her very existence was already changing the battlefield. The French soldiers, once broken and scattered, were rallying. Morale was surging, and that was dangerous, no matter what they believed about the girl at the center of it. The journey to Orleans took several days. The army moving slowly under the weight of supplies and cannons, wagons creaking along muddy roads still soft from winter's thaw. Joan rode near the front, her white armor catching the light, her banner streaming above her like a promise made visible. She spoke often to the soldiers, moving among them with an ease that belied her youth and her inexperience. She asked them about their families, their homes, the things they fought for. She reminded them that they were not just soldiers, but sons of France, beloved by God, chosen to reclaim what had been stolen. She told them stories of the saints, of martyrs who had faced impossible odds and prevailed through faith. And when they camped at night, she led them in prayer, her voice rising clear and strong above the crackle of the fires, weaving their disparate fears and hopes into something unified and powerful. The voices spoke to her constantly during this time, their presence as steady as her own heartbeat. Saint Michael reminded her to be brave, to show no fear even when fear was the only reasonable response. Saint Catherine counseled her to remain pure, to guard her body and her soul against the corruption that war could bring. Saint Margaret whispered encouragement when the doubts came creeping in. When Joan lay awake at night wondering if she was truly capable of what was being asked of her, the saints did not promise her that she would survive. They did not tell her that the path ahead would be easy or painless. But they promised her that if she remained faithful, if she trusted in God's plan, she would accomplish what she had been sent to do. And that, Joan realized, was all she needed to know. Her life was not her own. It belonged to God, and He would use it as He saw fit. The thought brought her peace, even as it filled her with a kind of holy terror. On April 29, 1429, Joan arrived at the outskirts of Orleans. The city lay before her, scarred and desperate, its walls pockmarked by cannon fire, its streets filled with people who had lived under siege for 6 long months. The English had built a ring of fortifications around the city, massive bastilles that controlled the roads and the river, choking off supplies and starving the defenders into submission. Inside the city, the people were exhausted, hungry, and on the verge of surrender. They had fought bravely, but bravery alone could not hold back an army as powerful and relentless as the English forces. They needed a miracle. And when word spread that Joan had arrived, Joan the maid, the girl sent by God, the city erupted. People poured into the streets, weeping and cheering, reaching out to touch her as she rode past, as though her mere presence could heal their suffering. Joan was overwhelmed. She had expected skepticism, resistance, perhaps even hostility. But instead, she was greeted like a savior, and the weight of their hope nearly crushed her. She met with the French commanders inside the city, hardened, practical men who had been fighting this siege for months and who were not particularly thrilled to take orders from a teenage girl. They respected her courage, admired her faith, but they doubted her judgment. She had no military training, they reminded her. She did not understand the complexities of siege warfare, the logistics of supply lines, the importance of strategic positioning. Joan listened to their objections with patience, and then she told them simply that God had sent her to lift the siege, and that was what she intended to do. The commanders were torn. On one hand, she was clearly inexperienced. On the other, the soldiers adored her, and morale had never been higher. In the end, they decided to humor her, to let her participate in minor skirmishes while they continued to plan the real strategy. It was a compromise born of condescension, and Joan knew it. But she did not argue. She would prove herself not with words, but with action. The voices told her the time had come. They instructed her to attack the English Bastille of Saint-Loup, a fortification on the eastern side of the city. Joan informed the commanders, and though they were skeptical, they allowed the assault to proceed. On May 4th, the attack began. Joan rode at the front, her banner held high, her voice ringing out over the chaos of battle. She did not carry a weapon to strike with. Her sword remained sheathed, a symbol rather than a tool of violence, but her presence was a weapon all its own. The soldiers fought with a ferocity they had not felt in months, inspired by the sight of this girl in white armor who seemed utterly unafraid of death. The English, confronted by this sudden, savage onslaught, began to falter. By the end of the day, the Bastille of Saint-Loup had fallen, and the French had won their first significant victory in the siege. The city celebrated wildly, and Joan, exhausted and shaken by the violence she had witnessed, retreated to a quiet corner to pray. She wept for the men who had died, English and French alike, and asked God to forgive the necessity of their deaths. The voices comforted her, told her that this was only the beginning, and that she must be strong for what was still to come. The commanders, humbled and astonished, began to listen to her more seriously. Over the next few days, Joan led assault after assault on the English fortifications, each one more daring than the last. She was struck by an arrow during one battle, the bolt piercing her shoulder and driving deep into the flesh. The pain was excruciating, and she was carried from the field, blood streaming down her armor. The soldiers despaired, thinking she was finished, but Joan refused to quit. She had the arrow removed, endured the agony without complaint, and returned to the battle within hours, her banner in hand, rallying the men who had thought they had lost her. It was a moment of such sheer, impossible courage that even the skeptics could no longer deny it. This girl was something beyond ordinary. Whether she was truly sent by God or simply possessed of a will that could not be broken, it no longer mattered. She was their leader, their symbol, their hope made flesh, and they would follow her wherever she led, even into the jaws of death itself. The wound in Joan's shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, a dull, insistent reminder that even faith could not shield flesh from iron. But she did not allow herself to dwell on the pain. There was too much yet to be done, too many English Bastilles still standing like teeth in a jaw clamped around the throat of Orleans. The voices urged her forward, whispering that victory was within reach, that the tide was turning, that she must not falter now when everything hung in the balance. On May 7, 1429, the assault on the fortress of Les Tourelles began, the most formidable of all the English positions, a massive stone structure that controlled the southern approach to the city and the vital bridge across the Loire River. If Les Tourelles could be taken, the siege would be broken. If it could not, all the progress of the past days would mean nothing. Joan knew this, and so did every man in the French army. This was the moment that would define everything. The attack began at dawn, the sky still gray and uncertain, the air thick with the smoke of cooking fires and the metallic tang of anticipation. Joan rode out with the assault force, her banner streaming behind her, its white fabric catching the early light like a signal fire. The English defenders were ready, positioned behind thick walls and armed with crossbows, cannons, and a grim determination born of months of successful resistance. They had repelled every French attempt to dislodge them, and they saw no reason why this day should be any different. But they had not yet faced Joan in full fury. She led the charge across the narrow bridge, her voice rising above the din of battle, calling on the soldiers to fight for God, for France, for the freedom of their city. Arrows rained down like dark hail, and men fell screaming into the river below, their armor dragging them down into the cold, merciless water. But Joan did not retreat. She pressed forward, and the men followed, driven by something beyond strategy or duty-driven by love for this impossible girl who seemed willing to die for them. The fighting was brutal, hand to hand, the kind of combat that strips away all pretense and reduces men to their most primal instincts. Joan stood on a scaling ladder, urging the soldiers upward, when an English crossbowman took aim and fired. The bolt struck her between the neck and shoulder, punching through a gap in her armor and embedding itself deep in her flesh. She cried out and fell backward, crashing to the ground with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. The soldiers around her froze, horror washing over their faces. Their leader, their saint, was down. Some rushed to her side, trying to shield her body with their own, while others began to retreat, certain that without Joan, the battle was lost. The English, seeing her fall, roared in triumph. They had brought down the witch, the false prophet, and now the French would scatter like sheep before wolves. But Joan did not die. She lay on the ground, gasping, her vision swimming with pain, and the voices came to her, urgent, commanding, filled with a love so fierce it burned away the agony. They told her to rise, to return to the fight, that her work was not yet finished. She reached down and pulled the arrow from her own body, gritting her teeth against the scream that wanted to tear free from her throat. Blood soaked her tunic, warm and sticky, but she forced herself to her feet. Her squire, Jean d'Aulon, begged her to withdraw, to let the surgeons tend to her, but Joan shook her head. She asked for a moment to pray, and she knelt there in the mud and the blood, her hands clasped, her lips moving in silent conversation with the saints who had never abandoned her. When she rose again, her face was calm, almost luminous. She took up her banner, and without a word, she walked back toward the battle. The sight of her return electrified the French soldiers. They had thought her dead or dying, and yet here she was, wounded but unbroken, walking back into the heart of the storm as though death itself had no claim on her. A roar went up from the ranks, a sound that was part battle cry and part prayer, and the men surged forward with renewed fury. Joan planted her banner at the base of the fortress wall, and she shouted to the soldiers that God was with them, that victory was theirs if they would only seize it. The English, shaken by her resurrection, began to falter. How could they fight someone who would not stay down, who seemed to rise again and again, no matter how many times they struck her? The psychological impact was devastating. The French scaled the walls, poured over the ramparts, and within hours, Les Tourelles had fallen. The English commander, William Glasdale, died trying to escape, his body plunging into the river when a bridge collapsed beneath him. By evening, the fortress was in French hands, and the siege of Orleans was over. The city erupted in celebration. Church bells rang out across the rooftops, their joyous clamor echoing through streets that had known only fear and hunger for half a year. People poured out of their homes, weeping and singing, embracing soldiers and strangers alike. Children ran through the squares, laughing for the first time in months. And at the center of it all was Joan, her armor still stained with blood, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes bright with quiet satisfaction. She had done what the voices had promised. She had lifted the siege. She had saved Orleans. The impossible had become real, and France, for the first time in decades, dared to believe that it might survive, But Joan did not linger in the celebration. She knew that Orleans was only the beginning, not the end. The voices had told her that the Dauphin must be crowned in Reims, the traditional seat of French coronation, and that only then would his legitimacy be unquestionable. Charles himself was hesitant, surrounded by advisors who counseled caution, who argued that they should consolidate their gains before pushing deeper into enemy territory. But Joan was insistent. She sought an audience with the Dauphin, and when she stood before him in his chamber, still wearing the armor that had carried her through the battle, she spoke with a clarity and urgency that left no room for doubt. She told him that God had given them this victory, and that God now demanded they press forward. The English were reeling, their confidence shattered. If they moved quickly, they could reclaim city after city, pushing the invaders back until Charles could walk into Reims and take his rightful crown. The time to act was now, while the momentum was theirs, while the people believed that heaven itself marched with them. Charles listened, torn between fear and hope. He had spent his entire life in the shadow of doubt about his legitimacy, his competence, his right to rule. But Joan had given him something he had never possessed before: victories. Real, undeniable victories that could not be explained away by luck or strategy alone. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps this was the moment to seize destiny rather than wait for it to slip through his fingers. He agreed, though reluctantly, to march toward Reims. The army would move through the Loire Valley, liberating towns along the way, proving to the people of France that their true king had returned. It was a bold plan, fraught with danger, but Joan had stopped believing in safe plans. The voices had shown her that faith required risk, that miracles did not come to those who played it safe. And so the army prepared to march, and Joan, her shoulders still aching from the wound that should have killed her, readied herself for the next chapter of the mission that had pulled her from the Fayed de Ney, fields of Domremy, and set her on a path that would reshape the history of a nation. The army left Orleans in early June, moving northwest through the heart of France, a great river of steel and faith flowing toward the cities that had bent their knees to English rule. Joan rode near the front, her white armor gleaming in the summer sun, her banner unfurled and dancing in the warm breeze. The wound in her shoulder had healed enough that she could lift her arm without crying out, though the scar remained, a permanent reminder that even the divinely guided were not invulnerable. Behind her marched thousands of soldiers, their spirits high, their loyalty no longer to their commanders alone but to this girl who had proven that the impossible could be achieved. They sang as they marched, hymns and battle songs intertwined, their voices carrying across the countryside like a proclamation that France was waking from a long, dark sleep. The first target was Jargeau, a fortified town held by the English under the command of the Earl of Suffolk. The French commanders were cautious, proposing a slow siege, a methodical approach that would minimize casualties. But Joan would have none of it. The voices told her that God favored the bold, that delay would only give the English time to regroup and reinforce. She urged an immediate assault, and though some of the generals grumbled, they had learned at Orleans that her instincts or her divine guidance, depending on what one believed, had a way of proving correct. On June 12th, the attack began. Joan was everywhere at once, it seemed, climbing ladders, rallying troops who wavered, her presence a constant, blazing reminder that heaven was watching. During the assault, a stone hurled from the walls struck her helmet with such force that she was knocked to the ground, dazed and struggling to rise. For a moment, the soldiers feared they had lost her again. But she shook off the blow, staggered to her feet and shouted that they must press on, that victory was within reach. Her resilience was inhuman, miraculous, and it drove the men to feats of courage they had not known they possessed. By evening, Jargeau had fallen, and the Earl of Suffolk was captured. Town after town followed the same pattern. Meung-sur-Loire fell swiftly, its English garrison retreating before the fury of the French advance. Beaugency surrendered after only a brief siege, its defenders recognizing the futility of resistance. Each victory fed the next, momentum building like a wave that nothing could stop. The common people of France, who had suffered under occupation for so long, began to see Joan as more than a warrior. She was a liberator, a symbol of divine justice, the answer to decades of unanswered prayers. When she entered the towns she had freed, they lined the streets to see her, reaching out to touch her horse, her armor, her banner, as though proximity to her could transfer some of her grace to them. Joan was humble in the face of their adoration. She reminded them always that she was not the source of these miracles, but only the instrument. Glory belonged to God alone. Yet her humility only deepened their love for her, for in a world ruled by prideful kings and grasping nobles, here was someone who wielded power without claiming it for herself. The English, meanwhile, were in disarray. Their commanders sent urgent messages back to Paris and London, warning that something unprecedented was happening, that the French were united in a way they had not been in generations, and that at the center of this resurgence was a girl who seemed immune to fear and doubt. Sir John Fastolf was dispatched with reinforcements, and the English forces regrouped near the village of Patay, determined to crush the French army and capture or kill Joan before her legend grew any further. The Battle of Patay, fought on June 18, 1429, would become one of the most decisive engagements of the entire war. The French, led by Joan's inspired presence and the tactical skill of commanders like the Duke of Alencon and La Hire, caught the English by surprise. The English archers, the dreaded longbowmen who had won so many victories at Crécy and Agincourt, were overrun before they could properly position themselves. The battle was swift and brutal, more of a rout than a contest. The English lost thousands, and their greatest commanders were either killed or captured. The French, by contrast, suffered only minimal casualties. It was a reversal so complete, so stunning, that even Joan's most devoted followers struggled to comprehend it. In a single afternoon, the myth of English invincibility had been shattered. Joan did not celebrate the slaughter. She walked among the wounded and the dying after the battle, her heart heavy with the cost of victory. She knelt beside English soldiers who lay bleeding in the grass, and she prayed for their souls, her voice soft and tender, as though they were her own brothers. Some of the French soldiers were puzzled by this, even irritated. These were the enemy, after all, the men who had killed and pillaged and occupied their homeland. Why should Joan waste her compassion on them? But Joan saw no contradiction. The voices had told her to fight, and she had fought. But they had also told her to remain pure, to remember that every soul was precious in God's eyes, and that even in war, mercy was a virtue. She wept for the English dead as she wept for the French, and in that weeping, she revealed the full measure of her humanity, a girl who carried the weight of divine mission, but who never lost sight of the suffering that mission caused. With the road to Reims now open, the army pressed northward, moving deeper into territory that had been under English and Burgundian control for years. Towns that had sworn allegiance to the English king now found themselves facing a choice: submit to the returning French or face the consequences. Most chose submission. The sight of Joan's banner on the horizon was enough to convince them that resistance was futile. In many cases, the English garrisons simply withdrew without a fight, abandoning their posts rather than face the tide that was sweeping across the land. It was not just military force that drove them away, but something more intangible, the sense that the momentum of history had shifted, that what had once seemed inevitable was now in doubt. Joan had become a force of nature, and like a storm, she could not be reasoned with or negotiated away. She could only be endured or fled from. As the army drew closer to Reims, Joan's thoughts turned increasingly to the Dauphin. Charles had followed the army, though reluctantly, still surrounded by advisors who whispered caution and doubt. Joan knew that his coronation was the culmination of everything she had been sent to accomplish. Once he was crowned and anointed with the holy oil in the ancient cathedral of Reims, his legitimacy would be beyond question. The English could call him a pretender all they liked, but the sacred ritual would transform him into a true king, blessed by God and recognized by the Church. It was this goal that had driven her from the beginning, and now it was within reach. But Joan also felt a growing unease, a sense that once the coronation was complete, her mission might be over, and she did not know what would come after. The voices had been clear about what she must do up to this point, but they had said little about what would follow. She tried to push the worry aside, to focus on the present, but it lingered at the edges of her thoughts like a shadow she could not quite escape. On July 16, 1429, the army arrived at Reims. The city opened its gates without resistance, and the people poured out to greet Joan and the Dauphin with joy and relief. Preparations for the coronation began immediately, and on July 17th, in the great cathedral of Reims, Charles VII was crowned King of France. Joan stood nearby, her banner held high, tears streaming down her face as she watched the fulfillment of the promise the voices had made to her 2 years earlier in her father's garden. She had done it. Against all odds, against all reason, she had led the Dauphin to his coronation. France had a king again, and the English claim to the throne had been dealt a blow from which it would never fully recover. After the ceremony, Charles approached Joan and asked her what reward she desired, what honor he could bestow upon her for all she had accomplished. Joan asked for nothing for herself. She asked only that her village Domremy be exempted from taxes, a small kindness for the people who had raised her. Charles granted the request, moved by her humility, and the exemption would remain in place for centuries, a quiet testament to the girl who had changed the world and asked for nothing in return. But even as the celebrations echoed through the streets of Reims, even as the wine flowed and the people danced, Joan felt the weight of something shifting. The voices were quieter now, less urgent, as though the crescendo had passed and what remained was only echo. She stood alone in the cathedral after the crowds had gone, the candles burning low, the silence pressing in around her. She knelt before the altar and asked the saints what came next, but their answer was vague, uncertain. They told her to remain faithful, to continue to serve, but they did not tell her how or for how long. For the first time since leaving Domremy, Joan felt truly afraid, not of death or pain, but of the possibility that her purpose was complete and that everything that followed would be a slow descent into darkness. She prayed until the dawn crept through the stained glass windows, and when she finally rose, her knees stiff and her heart heavy, she made a quiet vow to herself. Whatever time she had left, she would use it in service to France and to God, and she would trust that when the end came, it would come in the manner heaven had always intended. The days following the coronation should have been filled with triumph and strategic planning, but instead, they were marked by hesitation and political maneuvering. Charles, now a consecrated king, seemed content to rest on his laurels, to consolidate what had been won rather than press forward to reclaim all that remained under English control. His advisors, many of whom had never truly believed in Joan's mission, now whispered that her usefulness had come to an end. She had fulfilled her divine purpose, they said. The king was crowned. Perhaps it was time for her to return to her village, to live out her days in peace and piety, to become a symbol rather than an active force. Joan heard these whispers, felt the shifting currents of the court, and she understood with a clarity that cut like a blade she was becoming inconvenient. The very qualities that had made her invaluable on the battlefield, her certainty, her unwillingness to compromise, her direct line to divine authority, now made her a threat to men who preferred their power unchallenged by heaven. But Joan could not simply walk away. The voices, though quieter, had not released her. They told her that Paris must be retaken, that the English still held the heart of France, and that until the capital was liberated, the work was unfinished. She pleaded with Charles to authorize an assault on Paris, to strike while the English were still reeling from their losses. But the king was reluctant. Paris was heavily fortified, defended by thousands of English and Burgundian troops. An assault could fail, and failure would tarnish the string of miraculous victories that had brought him this far. His advisors counseled negotiation instead, suggesting truces and treaties that might win back Paris through diplomacy rather than blood. Joan listened to these arguments with growing frustration. She had not come this far, had not bled and suffered and watched men die, only to see the momentum squandered in the service of political caution. But she was not queen. She was not even a noble. She was a peasant girl who had been given temporary authority by virtue of her divine mission, and that authority was already beginning to erode. Despite the king's reluctance, Joan managed to gather a force willing to march on Paris. In early September, she led an assault on the city's fortifications, attacking the gate of Saint Honor with the same fervor she had brought to Orleans. But this time, something was different. The voices were less clear, their guidance less certain. The soldiers, though still loyal to Joan, were tired and weary, sensing that the tide of miraculous fortune might be turning. The assault was fierce but disorganized, and the defenders of Paris, well prepared and heavily armed, repelled the attack with devastating efficiency. Joan was struck by a crossbow bolt in the thigh, the impact sending her sprawling. She tried to rise, tried to rally the men for another push, but the pain was too great, and the soldiers, seeing her wounded and the assault failing, began to retreat. She was carried from the field, bleeding and furious, her banner left behind in the mud, a symbol of defeat that cut deeper than any physical wound. The failed assault on Paris marked a turning point. Joan's aura of invincibility had been punctured, and the doubts that had always existed beneath the surface began to rise again. Some whispered that God had withdrawn his favor, that Joan had overreached, that her mission had ended at Reims and everything after was human ambition rather than divine command. Joan herself was tormented by the failure. She prayed desperately for clarity, for some sign that she had not misunderstood the voices, that she had not led men to their deaths out of pride rather than obedience. The saints reassured her, but their words were gentler now, tinged with a sadness she had not heard before. They told her to endure, to remain faithful, but they did not promise her further victories. It was as though they were preparing her for something she did not yet understand, something she was not ready to face. Charles, shaken by the defeat at Paris, began to distance himself from Joan. He did not cast her aside outright. That would have been politically disastrous given how beloved she was among the common soldiers and the people, but he no longer sought her counsel as he once had. He signed a truce with the Duke of Burgundy, a temporary peace that Joan believed was a mistake, a surrender of momentum that would allow the English to regroup and strengthen their positions, but her objections were ignored. The king's court had moved on, focused now on diplomacy and consolidation, and Joan found herself increasingly sidelined, a relic of a more desperate time when miracles had seemed necessary. She remained with the army, still wearing her armor, still carrying her banner, but her role had shifted from leader to symbol, from active force to passive icon. In the spring of 1430, fighting resumed despite the truce. Skirmishes and sieges erupting across the contested territories as both sides jockeyed for advantage. Joan threw herself into these campaigns with the same intensity she had always shown, perhaps even more so, as though she could prove through sheer determination that she was still needed, still useful. She participated in the defense of Compiègne, a town besieged by Burgundian forces allied with the English. On May 23rd, during a sortie from the town, Joan and a small force engaged the enemy outside the walls. The fighting was chaotic, and as the French began to retreat back into Compiègne, the gates were closed prematurely, whether by accident, cowardice, or betrayal. No one could say for certain. Joan found herself cut off, surrounded by Burgundian soldiers who recognized her and closed in like wolves around wounded prey. She fought fiercely, swinging her sword not to kill, but to drive them back, to create space for escape. But there were too many, and her horse was pulled down. Hands grabbed at her, dragging her from the saddle, and though she struggled, she was overwhelmed. Within moments, Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, the girl who had crowned a king and saved a nation, was a prisoner. The soldiers who captured her could scarcely believe their fortune. They had taken the most famous woman in France, perhaps in all of Europe, and they knew that she was worth a king's ransom, or more accurately, worth delivering to those who wanted her silenced forever. Joan was bound and led away from the battlefield, her armor stripped from her, her banner lost in the mud. The voices which had guided her for so long fell silent, and in that silence, Joan understood with terrible clarity that the mission had entered its final, darkest chapter. News of her capture spread quickly. In Compiègne, the people wept. In the French army, soldiers who had followed her into battle stood in stunned disbelief, unable to comprehend that their invincible maid had fallen. And in Charles's court, the reaction was muted, almost indifferent. Some advisors suggested ransoming her, but the king made no move to do so. Joan had served her purpose, and now she was a complication, a reminder of a time when divine intervention had been necessary because human leadership had failed. To ransom her would be to admit that she was still important, still relevant, and that was a message Charles was unwilling to send. So Joan remained in captivity, passed from the Burgundians to the English, who saw in her trial an opportunity to destroy not just a girl, but the very foundation of French morale and legitimacy. Joan was taken to Rouen, a city firmly under English control, and there she was imprisoned in a tower, chained and guarded day and night. She was alone now, truly alone, without her army, without her king, without even her banner to remind her of the mission she had carried. But she was not without her faith. She prayed constantly, and though the voices did not speak as they once had, she felt their presence, a quiet assurance that she had not been abandoned. She knew that a trial was coming, that the English would use every tool at their disposal to discredit her, to paint her as a heretic and a witch. But she also knew that her fate had been sealed the moment she answered the voices in her father's garden all those years ago. She had been called to serve, and she had served. What came next was beyond her control, beyond even the reach of kings and bishops. It belonged to God, and in that knowledge, Joan found a fragile, flickering peace. The tower was cold, the walls damp with moisture that never quite dried, and the chains around her wrists and ankles chafed until her skin was raw. But Joan did not despair. She remembered the fields of Domremy, the sound of church bells, the faces of her family. She remembered the light that had first appeared to her, warm and impossibly bright, and the voice that had told her to be brave. She had been brave. She had done everything the voices had asked. And if this was where that obedience led to chains and darkness and a trial that would seek to destroy her, then so be it. She would endure. She would remain faithful. And when the flames finally came, as she sensed they would, she would meet them with the same courage she had brought to every battlefield, every siege, every impossible moment. Because Joan of Arc had never been fighting for her own glory. She had been fighting for something far greater, something that could not be chained or burned or erased. She had been fighting for the soul of France and for the belief that even in the darkest times, heaven still heard the cries of the faithful. The city of Orleans in the spring of 1429 was a place suspended between hope and annihilation. For 6 months, it had endured the slow, grinding torment of siege, a noose tightening day by day, cutting off supplies, strangling commerce, starving its people while English cannons lobbed stone and iron over its walls with merciless regularity. The citizens had grown gaunt, their faces hollowed by hunger, their eyes shadowed by sleepless nights spent listening to the distant sounds of enemy encampments, knowing that each dawn might be the one when the walls finally broke and the city fell. Orleans was more than just a strategic prize, it was a symbol. If it fell, the Loire Valley would be lost, and with it, any hope that the Dauphin Charles might reclaim his kingdom. The English knew this, the French knew this, and so the siege had dragged on, month after brutal month, until hope itself had become a luxury the people of Orleans could barely afford. Into this landscape of despair came Joan, riding through the gates on April 29th with an army at her back and a banner that proclaimed the names of Jesus and Mary in bold, defiant script. The people had heard rumors of her, the peasant girl who claimed to speak with saints, who had convinced the Dauphin to give her an army, who had promised to lift the siege and save the city. Some had dismissed the stories as fantasy, the desperate invention of a kingdom grasping at miracles. But when Joan appeared, real and solid and undeniably present, something shifted in the collective heart of Orleans. She was younger than many had imagined, her face still soft with youth, but she sat her horse with a confidence that seemed to radiate outward like heat from a forge. She wore white armor that caught the late afternoon light and turned her into something almost otherworldly, and her banner white silk stitched with divine names rippled above her like a promise given form. The people came out to meet her, first in small groups, then in waves, until the streets were filled with men, women, and children who reached out simply to touch her. as though contact alone might transfer some of her certainty to their own trembling hearts. They called her name Jehan, Joan, the maid, and they wept openly, tears of relief and exhaustion, and a desperate, fragile belief that perhaps, just perhaps, this girl might be the answer to their prayers. Joan moved through the crowd with grace, speaking gently to those who approached her, blessing children, reassuring the elderly, her voice calm and steady even as the weight of their hope threatened to overwhelm her. She had expected skepticism, resistance, the cold calculation of military men who would see her as an untrained girl playing at war. But the people's faith in her was immediate and absolute, and it terrified her even as it strengthened her resolve. She could not fail them. She would not. She met with the French commanders that evening in a stone hall lit by torches and filled with the smell of old smoke and older frustrations. These were men who had been fighting the siege for months, men like Jean de Dunois, the bastard of Orleans, and Etienne de Vigneaus, known as La Hire, warriors whose reputations had been forged in blood and whose patience had been worn thin by endless setbacks. They looked at Joan with expressions that ranged from curiosity to thinly veiled contempt. A girl, a peasant, someone who had never held a sword until a few weeks ago, now presuming to tell them how to conduct a siege. De Dunois was polite but firm. He welcomed her presence as a symbol, a morale booster for the troops. But he made it clear that military decisions would remain in the hands of those with actual experience. Joan listened, her face unreadable, and then she spoke with a directness that left no room for misunderstanding. She had not come to Orleans to be a mascot. She had come because God had sent her, and God's plan was not to wait and strategize but to attack, to drive the English from their fortifications, to break the siege through faith and action. The commanders were taken aback. Some were annoyed by her presumption. Others were intrigued despite themselves. There was something in her voice, in the absolute certainty with which she spoke, that made it difficult to dismiss her entirely. De Dunois, pragmatic and weary, decided to test her. He explained the military situation. The English had constructed a ring of bastilles around the city, fortified positions that controlled the roads and the river. Any assault would be costly, potentially disastrous if it failed. What did Joan propose? She did not hesitate. She told them that the voices had instructed her to begin with the Bastille of Saint-Laube on the eastern side of the city. Take that, and the momentum would shift. The English would begin to doubt, and the French would begin to believe. It was not a detailed tactical plan, but it was decisive, clear, and spoken with such conviction that even the skeptics found themselves considering it. De Dunois agreed, reluctantly, to allow the assault. If nothing else, it would show whether this girl was truly touched by God or simply deluded. May 4th dawned clear and cool, the kind of spring morning that felt almost cruel in its beauty, as though the world itself were indifferent to the violence about to unfold. Joan rose before the sun, attended Mass, and then donned her armor with the help of her squire. The white plate gleamed, newly polished, and as she fastened each piece, she felt the familiar presence of the voices, calm and reassuring, telling her that today would be the beginning of the end for the English occupation. She took up her banner, the fabric crisp and bright, and she rode out to join the soldiers assembling for the assault. They watched her approach, these men who had lived with death for so long that it had become routine, and something in their posture shifted. They stood a little straighter. They gripped their weapons a little tighter. The maid had arrived, and with her came the possibility, remote, impossible, but undeniable, that they might actually win. The attack on Saint-Loup began mid-morning, a surge of French soldiers pouring toward the English fortifications with a ferocity that caught the defenders off guard. Joan rode at the front, her banner held high, her voice rising above the clash of steel and the screams of the wounded. She did not wield a weapon to strike, her sword remained sheathed, a symbol rather than a tool of killing, but her presence was a weapon all its own. The soldiers fought as though they had been set aflame, driven by something beyond strategy or survival. They fought for her, for this girl who seemed utterly unafraid of death, who believed with such totality that God was on their side that her belief became theirs. The English, confronted by this unexpected onslaught, began to falter. They had held these walls for months, had repelled every French attempt to dislodge them. But they had never faced anything like this, an army inspired not by pay or plunder, but by faith, led by a girl who seemed to glow with divine purpose. By late afternoon, the Bastille of Saint-Loup had fallen. The English defenders were either dead, captured, or fled, and the French soldiers stood among the ruins, breathless and bloodied and almost unable to believe what they had accomplished. Joan dismounted and walked through the aftermath, her face pale, her eyes filled with tears. She knelt beside the bodies, French and English alike, and she prayed for their souls, her voice trembling with grief. The soldiers watched her, confused by this display of sorrow in the midst of victory. But Joan could not separate the triumph from the cost. The voices had told her to fight, and she had obeyed. But they had not told her that obedience would require her to wade through rivers of blood, to watch young men die screaming, to carry the weight of their deaths in her heart long after the battle was over. She wept, and her tears were for all of them, the victors and the vanquished, the faithful and the lost. And in that moment, the soldiers understood that Joan was not simply a warrior. She was something far more complicated, far more human, a girl who carried the burden of heaven's commands and the anguish of earth's realities, and who somehow found the strength to endure both. The fall of Saint-Loup sent shockwaves through both armies. For the French, it was a validation of everything Joan had promised, that God was with them, that the impossible could be made real through faith and courage. For the English, it was the first crack in a facade of invincibility they had maintained for months. Rumors spread through their ranks with the speed of plague. This maid was more than human. She was a witch, a sorceress, perhaps even a demon sent to destroy them. The English commanders tried to dismiss such talk as superstition, but they could not entirely suppress the unease that had taken root in their soldiers' hearts. Men who had fought without fear for years now looked toward the walls of Orleans and wondered if they were fighting against flesh and blood or against something far more terrifying. Joan gave the soldiers no time to rest on their victory. The voices urged her forward, told her that momentum was everything, that hesitation would allow the English to regroup and harden their resolve. On May 5th, she led an assault on the Bastille of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, but the English abandoned it before the fighting could begin in earnest, retreating to a stronger position at the nearby fortress of Les Augustins. Joan pursued them without pause, her army flowing behind her like a tide that could not be turned back. The battle for Les Augustins was fierce and chaotic, fought in the narrow streets and courtyards of the abandoned monastery that the English had converted into a fortress. Joan was everywhere at once, her banner a constant point of reference in the swirling confusion, her voice cutting through the noise to rally soldiers who had lost their way or their nerve. She moved with a grace that seemed impossible for someone in full armor, as though the weight of the steel was nothing compared to the lightness of her purpose. During the assault, a group of French soldiers found themselves pinned down, caught between English archers and a collapsing wall. They were moments from being slaughtered when Joan appeared, riding straight into the danger, her banner streaming behind her. She did not attack the English directly, but her presence was enough. The soldiers, inspired by her fearlessness, surged forward with renewed strength and drove the enemy back. By nightfall, Les Augustins had fallen, and the French had secured a position directly across from the most formidable of all the English fortifications, Les Tourelles. Joan knew, and her commanders knew, that this was the key. If Les Tourelles could be taken, the siege would be broken. But it was also the most heavily defended position the English held, a massive stone fortress guarding the southern bridge across the Loire, garrisoned by hundreds of soldiers and bristling with cannons and crossbows. Taking it would require not just courage, but a willingness to accept casualties that might be catastrophic. That night, Joan returned to the city exhausted, her armor caked with mud and blood, her body aching from the day's fighting. She attended Mass, as she always did, and then she knelt alone in the chapel of a small church, her hands clasped, her lips moving in silent prayer. The voices came to her then, clearer than they had been in days, and they told her what she already knew in her heart. Tomorrow would be the decisive battle. Tomorrow, she would either fulfill the promise she had made to lift the siege, or she would die trying. They told her not to be afraid, that her purpose was known to God, and that whatever happened, she would not be abandoned. Joan listened, and she felt a strange peace settle over her. The kind of peace that comes when all choices have been made and all that remains is to see them through. She slept fitfully that night, her dreams filled with light and fire, with voices calling her name from distances she could not measure. May 7 began before dawn, the sky still dark and star-studded when Joan rose and prepared herself for battle. She attended Mass, took communion, and then dressed in her armor with the methodical care of someone performing a sacred ritual. Each piece of plate was a prayer, each buckle a benediction. When she emerged into the pre-dawn darkness, the soldiers were already gathering, their faces grim but determined. They had seen what Joan could do, had watched her turn defeat into victory through sheer force of will and faith. If she said today was the day the siege would be broken, they believed her. They had no choice but to believe her, because the alternative, that this had all been for nothing, that they would die here in the mud outside Orleans, was too terrible to contemplate. The assault on Les Tourelles began as the sun crested the horizon, flooding the battlefield with golden light that seemed both beautiful and cruel. Joan led the charge across the narrow causeway that connected the southern bank to the fortress, her banner held high, her voice rising in a battle cry that was half prayer and half defiance. The English defenders unleashed everything they had. Arrows darkened the sky. Cannonballs tore through the ranks. Boiling oil poured from the ramparts onto the men below. The French soldiers fell in waves, their bodies piling up on the causeway, their screams blending into a single terrible sound that seemed to shake the very stones of the fortress. But Joan did not retreat. She pressed forward, and the men followed because they could not bear to let her go alone. She reached the base of the fortress wall and grabbed a scaling ladder, beginning to climb despite the hail of projectiles raining down around her. She was halfway up when a crossbow bolt, fired from close range, struck her between the neck and shoulder. The impact was tremendous, the bolt punching through a gap in her armor and burying itself deep in her flesh. Joan cried out a sound of shock and pain that cut through the din of battle, and she fell backward, crashing to the ground with a sickening thud. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The French soldiers, seeing their maid fall, froze in horror. The English defenders, seeing the witch brought down, roared in savage triumph. Joan lay on the ground, gasping, her vision blurring, blood spreading across her white armor in a dark, damning stain. Her squire, Jean d'Aulon, and several soldiers rushed to her side, trying to shield her body with their own, shouting for retreat. But Joan, even through the agony, shook her head. She reached up with trembling hands and grasped the shaft of the bolt protruding from her shoulder. Without hesitation, without waiting for a surgeon or even a moment to brace herself, she pulled. The bolt came free in a single wrenching motion, and Joan screamed, a sound that was raw and human and utterly heartbreaking. Blood poured from the wound, soaking her tunic, and for a moment she thought she might faint. But the voices came to her then, urgent and commanding, telling her to rise, to return to the battle, that her work was not yet finished. She struggled to her feet, waving away the hands that tried to restrain her, and she asked for a moment to pray. She knelt there in the midst of the carnage, surrounded by the dead and the dying, her own blood dripping onto the stones, and she prayed with an intensity that seemed to make the very air around her vibrate. The soldiers watched, transfixed, as this girl who should have been broken by pain and fear instead found strength in her communion with the divine. When she opened her eyes, they were clear and bright, filled with a light that had nothing to do with the sun. She stood, took up her banner again, and without a word, she walked back toward the fortress. The French soldiers, seeing her return, felt something surge through them, not courage exactly, but something deeper, something primal. If she could endure this, if she could stand when any rational person would have fled, then so could they. They followed her, roaring, weeping, beyond thought or fear, driven by a force that transcended tactics or self-preservation. Joan planted her banner at the base of the fortress wall, the white fabric now stained with dirt and blood, but still visible, still defiant. She turned to the soldiers gathered around her, their faces a mixture of awe and desperation, and she spoke in a voice that somehow carried above the chaos. She told them that God was with them, that the English could not stand against heaven's will, that if they would only press forward with faith, the fortress would fall before the day was done. Her words were simple, almost plain, but they carried a weight that no amount of eloquence could have matched. The soldiers believed her because she had bled for them, because she had pulled an arrow from her own body and walked back into hell without hesitation. If that was not proof of divine favor, then nothing would ever be. The assault resumed with a fury that shocked even the most experienced commanders. The French soldiers threw themselves at the walls with reckless abandon, climbing ladders even as they were pushed away, rushing forward even as their comrades fell beside them. Joan moved among them, not fighting with a blade, but fighting nonetheless, pulling men to their feet when they stumbled, directing groups to weak points in the defenses, her presence a constant, blazing reminder of why they were here and what they were fighting for. The English defenders, who had held these walls against every previous assault, began to falter. They had faced brave men before, desperate men, angry men. But they had never faced an army that seemed utterly indifferent to death, an army that fought as though they were already assured of victory, and the battle was merely a formality. The turning point came in the late afternoon. A group of French soldiers managed to gain a foothold on the ramparts, and once the first breach was made, it spread like fire through dry wood. More men poured over the walls, engaging the English in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Joan, still on the ground below, felt the voices surge within her, telling her that the moment had come, that victory was within reach. She called out to the soldiers still hesitating at the base of the walls, and her voice, hoarse from shouting, weakened by blood loss, somehow reached every ear. She told them to climb, to finish what they had started, and as if in response to her command, a final wave of French soldiers surged upward. The English line broke. Men began to retreat, first in small groups, then in a panicked rush, abandoning their positions and fleeing toward the bridge that connected Les Tourelles to the English-held north bank. William Glasdale, the English commander of Les Tourelles, tried to organize a retreat across the bridge, shouting orders even as his men streamed past him in disorder. But the bridge, damaged by previous fighting and now burdened by the weight of hundreds of armored men, began to groan and sway. Joan, watching from the fortress wall, felt a sudden, overwhelming sadness. She called out to Glasdale, warning him to surrender, to save himself and his men. But he could not hear her, or perhaps he chose not to, and he continued his retreat. The bridge collapsed with a sound like thunder, and Glasdale, along with dozens of his soldiers, plunged into the Loire River. Weighed down by their armor, they sank like stones, their arms flailing uselessly as the dark water closed over their heads. Joan turned away, unable to watch, tears streaming down her face. The voices had promised her victory, but they had not told her it would feel like this, like grief wrapped around triumph, like death masquerading as deliverance. By evening, Les Tourelles was in French hands, and the siege of Orleans was effectively over. The remaining English forces, demoralized and leaderless, withdrew from their other bastilles during the night, abandoning months of work and investment in a single panicked evacuation. When dawn broke on May 8th, the people of Orleans woke to a silence they had not heard in half a year. The silence of a city no longer under siege. They poured into the streets, laughing and weeping, embracing strangers, falling to their knees in prayer. The church bells rang out across the city, a joyful clamor that seemed to shake loose all the fear and despair that had accumulated over the long months of suffering. Orleans was free. Against all odds, against all military logic, the city had been saved. And at the center of the miracle stood a 19-year-old girl whose shoulder was wrapped in bloodied bandages, and whose eyes reflected both the glory of victory and the terrible cost it had demanded. Joan did not join the celebrations. She retreated to a quiet chapel, away from the crowds and the noise, and she knelt before the altar in silence. Her body ached with exhaustion, the wound in her shoulder throbbing with each heartbeat, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the weight in her chest. She had seen men die, so many men, French and English, young and old, their lives snuffed out in an instant or dragged out in agonizing slowness. She had heard their final screams, seen the light fade from their eyes, and she knew that she would carry those images with her for whatever time remained. The voices had told her that this would be necessary, that liberation required sacrifice, but knowing it intellectually and experiencing it viscerally were two entirely different things. She prayed for the souls of the dead, all of them, and she asked God to forgive her for the part she had played in their deaths. even though she knew she had only been doing what he had commanded. The Duke of Alencon found her there, hours later, still kneeling in the dim chapel. He approached quietly and placed a hand on her shoulder, the uninjured one, and told her that the entire city was calling for her, that they wanted to see her, to thank her, to celebrate the maid who had saved them. Joan looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes and asked softly if they understood what it had cost, if they knew how many had died to give them this freedom. Alencon was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. They knew, he said, or at least they would come to know. But for now, they needed to believe in the miracle, needed to see in her something pure and untainted by the horror of war. She was their symbol, their saint, their hope made flesh. Joan sighed, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient within her, and she allowed Alencon to help her to her feet. She would go to the people. She would let them celebrate. But she would not pretend, even to herself, that victory was anything other than a beautiful, terrible, necessary tragedy. When Joan finally emerged into the streets, the roar that greeted her was deafening. Thousands of people lined the roads, waving banners, throwing flowers, reaching out to touch her as she passed. Children were lifted onto their parents' shoulders to catch a glimpse of her. Old women wept and made the sign of the cross. Young men shouted her name until their voices broke. Joan moved through it all in a kind of daze, smiling when she was expected to smile, waving when she was expected to wave, but inside she felt hollow, emptied out by the intensity of the past days. The voices whispered reassurances, told her that she had done well, that this was only the beginning of what she would accomplish. But Joan could not shake the feeling that something had shifted, that the girl who had left Domremy filled with pure, uncomplicated faith had been replaced by someone who understood that faith and suffering were inseparable, that serving God meant carrying burdens too heavy for any single soul to bear. That night, a feast was held in her honor, tables laden with food that seemed almost obscene after months of rationing and hunger. Joan sat at the place of honor, surrounded by nobles and commanders who toasted her with wine and spoke of her in terms usually reserved for ancient heroes and mythical figures. She ate little, drank nothing, and spoke even less. La Hire, the gruff warrior who had fought beside her, leaned over at one point and asked if she was well. Joan looked at him, this man who had killed without hesitation or remorse for years, and she told him simply that she would never be well again, not in the way she had been before. But she would continue. She would do what the voices commanded, because that was all she knew how to do and all she had ever been meant to do. The liberation of Orleans marked the beginning of Joan's legend, the moment when she transformed from an obscure peasant girl into a figure of historical significance. But it also marked the beginning of her understanding of what that significance would cost. She had saved a city, yes. She had broken a siege that should have been unbreakable. But she had also learned that miracles were not clean or simple, that divine intervention came wrapped in human suffering, and that the voices that had called her from her quiet life would demand from her every drop of strength, every shred of innocence, every breath until there was nothing left to give. And even knowing this, even understanding the price, Joan would continue forward because she had been chosen, and chosen people did not have the luxury of turning back. They could only walk the path laid before them, no matter where it led, no matter how dark the shadows grew along the way. Orleans was saved. But Joan, in some fundamental way, was lost not to despair or doubt, but to a mission that had become larger than her own life. and from which there would be no escape save through death itself. The months following the coronation at Reims should have been a time of consolidation and triumph, a period when the newly crowned King Charles VII rallied France to reclaim all that had been lost. But instead, the court settled into a cautious lethargy, a politics of hesitation that frustrated Joan to the point of despair. She had fulfilled the primary mission the voices had given her. The Dauphin was now the anointed king. Crowned in the sacred cathedral with holy oil, his legitimacy no longer in question. Yet France was still divided, Paris still occupied, and the English grip on the northern territories remained firm. Joan pleaded with Charles to authorize continued campaigns to press the advantage while the English were still reeling. But the king, surrounded by advisors who preferred negotiation to warfare, who saw Joan as a useful symbol but a dangerous force if left unchecked, began to drift away from her counsel. He thanked her for her service. He honored her with titles and exemptions. But he did not listen. Joan found herself in a strange limbo, still attached to the army but no longer central to its decisions. She was paraded before troops to boost morale, her presence invoked like a talisman. But when strategy was discussed, the doors closed and she was left outside. The commanders who had once hung on her every word now treated her with polite distance, as though she were a relic from a more desperate time, necessary then but inconvenient now. Joan felt the shift keenly, felt herself becoming irrelevant even as the work remained unfinished. The voices, too, had changed. They still spoke to her, but their tone had darkened, filled with warnings she did not fully understand. They told her to remain strong, to endure what was coming, but they no longer promised her victories. They spoke instead of suffering, of trials, of a crown not of gold but of thorns. Joan tried to push away the growing sense of dread, but it clung to her like a shadow she could not escape. In the autumn of 1429, she participated in an ill-fated assault on Paris, the capital that remained stubbornly in English hands. The attack was poorly planned and half-heartedly supported by the king's forces. Joan fought with her usual intensity, leading men across trenches and toward the city walls, but this time the magic did not hold. She was wounded again, a crossbow bolt piercing her thigh, and the assault collapsed into chaos. The retreat was humiliating, a stark contrast to the miraculous victories at Orleans and Patay. Joan was carried from the field, bleeding and furious, her banner abandoned in the mud. It felt like a betrayal, not by her soldiers, who had fought bravely, but by the forces of heaven that seemed suddenly to have withdrawn their favor. She prayed desperately for understanding, and the voices told her that God's plans were not always comprehensible, that sometimes faith required enduring failure as well as celebrating success. It was small comfort. Charles signed a truce with the Duke of Burgundy shortly after the failed Paris assault, a 4-month cessation of hostilities that Joan believed was a catastrophic mistake. The Burgundians, allied with the English, had been wavering, and Joan felt certain that continued pressure would bring them back to the French side. But the truce gave them time to regroup, to strengthen their positions, and worst of all, it signaled to everyone that the king no longer believed in the inevitability of total victory. Joan protested vehemently, but her objections were dismissed. She was a soldier, they told her, not a diplomat. She should leave matters of state to those who understood such things. The condescension stung more than any physical wound, and Joan retreated into prayer, seeking guidance from the voices that had always been her anchor. They told her to continue fighting, that her mission was not complete. But they also warned her that the road ahead would be dark and painful, that she would face trials beyond anything she had yet experienced. Winter passed slowly. The army scattered in garrisons across the reclaimed territories, waiting for spring and the resumption of hostilities. Joan spent those months in a kind of restless agitation, moving from town to town, attending to small skirmishes and minor sieges, anything to feel useful. But the sense of purpose that had once filled her so completely now felt fragmented, elusive. She was still devoted to the mission, still obedient to the voices, but she could not shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that the tide which had lifted her so high was now beginning to recede. She wrote letters to various towns, urging them to remain loyal to Charles, warning them that the English would return if France did not remain vigilant. Some of the letters were respectful, even affectionate. Others were received with skepticism. The girl who had seemed invincible at Orleans now seemed merely human, and humans, even extraordinary ones, could fail. In the spring of 1430, fighting resumed despite the truce, which had collapsed under the weight of mutual distrust and broken promises. Joan threw herself into the campaigns with renewed intensity, perhaps sensing that her time was running out, that whatever the voices had been warning her about was drawing near. She participated in several engagements, small victories and minor defeats, the ebb and flow of a war that had lost its earlier clarity. In May, she joined the defense of Compiègne, a strategically important town that the Burgundians, allied with the English, were besieging. The garrison commander welcomed her presence, hoping that her reputation alone might inspire the defenders to hold out until reinforcements arrived. Joan led several sorties from the town, harrying the besiegers, trying to disrupt their operations. The voices were insistent now, urgent in a way that made her chest tighten with anxiety. They told her to be prepared, to keep her faith strong, that soon she would face the greatest test of her life. On May 23rd, Joan led a sortie with a small force of soldiers attacking a Burgundian position outside the town walls. The fighting was fierce but inconclusive, and as the afternoon wore on, it became clear that the French were outnumbered. Joan ordered a retreat, and the soldiers began falling back toward Compiègne, running across the open ground as enemy reinforcements closed in from multiple directions. Joan remained at the rear, covering the retreat, ensuring that as many of her men as possible made it safely back to the town. But as the last of them approached the gates, something inexplicable happened. The gates were closed. Whether it was panic, cowardice, a miscommunication, or deliberate betrayal, no one would ever know for certain. But the result was undeniable. Joan and a handful of soldiers were trapped outside, cut off from safety, surrounded by enemy forces that were closing in like a noose. Joan fought with desperate intensity, her sword so long a symbol rather than a weapon, now swinging to keep the Burgundians at bay. But there were too many, and they were too determined. They knew who she was, recognized the armor, the banner that one of her companions still carried. Capturing Joan of Arc would be a prize beyond measure, worth more than gold, worth more than any military victory. They surged forward, and Joan's horse was brought down, crashing to the ground and pinning her leg beneath its weight. She struggled to free herself, but hands grabbed her, pulling at her armor, dragging her from beneath the dying animal. She fought them even then, kicking and twisting, but she was overwhelmed. Within moments, Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans, the girl who had crowned a king and saved a nation, was a prisoner. The moment Joan was dragged to her feet, her hands bound tightly behind her back, she felt the voices fall silent. It was not a gradual fading, but an immediate, terrible absence, as though a door had been slammed shut between her and the divine presence that had guided her for years. She stood there, surrounded by Burgundian soldiers who jeered and grabbed at her. And for the first time since leaving Domremy, she felt utterly, completely alone. The soldiers were exultant, shouting to one another about their prize, arguing over who would receive credit for the capture. They stripped her of her sword, her banner, even her gloves, taking these items as trophies. Joan said nothing. She kept her eyes down, her jaw clenched, willing herself not to show fear. But inside, the silence where the voices had been was deafening, and she wondered if God had abandoned her, if her mission had ended not in glory but in failure and capture. She was taken first to the camp of John of Luxembourg, a Burgundian nobleman who held her as a prisoner of war. He treated her with a strange mixture of respect and curiosity, as though she were some exotic creature he had captured and did not quite know what to do with. He questioned her about her voices, her visions, her victories, and Joan answered honestly but guardedly, uncertain of his intentions. Luxembourg was caught between competing interests. He could ransom her back to the French, which would be the honorable thing to do, or he could sell her to the English, which would be far more profitable and politically advantageous. Joan waited in his custody for weeks, held in a castle under guard, allowed some small comforts, but always watched, always aware that her fate was being negotiated by men who saw her not as a person but as a commodity. During this time, Joan attempted to escape. She was held in a tower room high above the ground, and one night she knotted together strips of cloth and bedding to fashion a rope. The guards were lax, confident that a girl could not possibly escape from such a height, but Joan was desperate. The voices, still silent, had left her with only her own will to guide her, and she believed that if she could just reach friendly territory, she could rejoin the fight, could continue the mission that had defined her entire existence. She lowered herself out the window, gripping the makeshift rope with hands that were soft from captivity, and she began to descend. But the rope was too short, or her knots too weak, and halfway down it gave way. Joan fell, plummeting through the darkness, and struck the ground with a sickening impact that knocked her unconscious. She woke hours later, her body racked with pain, unable to move without agony shooting through her limbs. She had survived the fall, but just barely. Her captors found her and dragged her back to the tower, and this time they watched her more carefully. The escape attempt had consequences. Luxembourg realized that keeping her was becoming dangerous, and the English were growing impatient, offering larger and larger sums for her transfer. In November 1430, Joan was sold to the English for 10,000 livres, a fortune that sealed her fate. She was moved under heavy guard to Rouen, a city firmly under English control, where she would be tried not as a prisoner of war but as a heretic and a witch. The English understood that executing Joan as a soldier would make her a martyr. But if they could prove her guilty of heresy, they could destroy not just her body but her legacy, painting her victories as the work of the devil rather than of God. Joan was imprisoned in Rouen Castle, locked in a small, damp cell and chained by the ankles and wrists to a heavy wooden block. The chains were short, restricting her movement, making even sleep a torment. She was guarded day and night by English soldiers who mocked her, threatened her, and on more than one occasion attempted to violate her. Joan clung to her male clothing, which offered some small protection, but the constant fear of assault added another layer of horror to her captivity. She was alone, completely and utterly alone, with no allies, no advocates, no one to speak in her defense. The French king, whom she had crowned and served with such devotion, made no attempt to ransom her, sent no emissaries to negotiate her release. Charles VII, it seemed, had decided that Joan was more useful to him as a memory than as a living, complicated presence. The trial began in January 1431, a proceeding that was judicial in name only. It was organized and overseen by Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, a man deeply loyal to the English cause, who saw Joan's trial as an opportunity to advance his own career and undermine the legitimacy of Charles V. The trial was designed to be a trap, a series of theological questions crafted to ensnare Joan no matter how she answered. She was accused of heresy, witchcraft, and dressing in men's clothing, a charge that seemed absurd given the circumstances, but that carried serious religious implications in the medieval world. Joan was brought before the court repeatedly, always in chains, always exhausted from sleepless nights and poor treatment, and questioned for hours by educated clerics who twisted her words and tried to make her contradict herself. But Joan, uneducated and unschooled in theology, defended herself with a clarity and dignity that astonished even her accusers. When they asked her if she was in a state of grace, a question designed to trap her, if she said yes, she was guilty of presumption. If she said no, she condemned herself. Joan answered simply, "If I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may God keep me there." It was a perfect answer, humble yet confident, and it silenced the court for a moment. When they questioned her about her voices, demanding to know if they came from God or from the devil, Joan responded that they came from God and that she trusted them more than she trusted any man in that room. When they pressed her about wearing men's clothing, she explained that it was necessary for protection, that she had been surrounded by soldiers, and that modesty required the security that such clothing provided. Her answers were straightforward, devoid of the elaborate theological language her accusers expected, and in their simplicity, they were devastating. The trial dragged on for weeks, a grinding, relentless interrogation that sought to break Joan's spirit and force her to recant her claims. The English were growing impatient. They wanted a conviction, wanted to see her burned, wanted to erase the symbol she had become. Cauchon, feeling the pressure, intensified the proceedings, bringing in more accusers, manufacturing evidence, twisting Joan's words into admissions of guilt. Joan, weakened by months of imprisonment, malnourished and exhausted, began to falter. The voices, which had been silent since her capture, returned briefly, whispering words of comfort but offering no clear guidance. They told her to endure, to remain faithful, but they did not tell her how to escape, did not promise her rescue. And Joan, for the first time in her life, began to despair. Not of God, but of her own ability to continue bearing the weight of what was being asked of her. In May, after months of interrogation, the court presented Joan with a choice. She could recant her claims, admit that her voices were false, that she had been deceived by the devil, that her victories were the result of sorcery rather than divine intervention, and in exchange, her sentence would be commuted to life imprisonment. Or she could maintain her testimony and be handed over to the secular authorities for execution. Joan, worn down by the endless questioning, terrified of the flames, and perhaps hoping that imprisonment would eventually lead to release or rescue, signed a document of abjuration. She recanted. She admitted that her voices were false. She agreed to wear women's clothing and to submit to the authority of the church. For a brief moment, it seemed she might be spared, but the recantation solved nothing. Joan was returned to her cell, still in chains, still guarded by hostile soldiers. And within days, she was wearing men's clothing again, whether because her women's clothing had been taken from her, or because she chose to resume the dress that had protected her. The records are unclear. When Cauchin learned of this, he saw his opportunity. Relapsed heretics, those who recanted and then returned to their sins, were to be handed over to secular authorities for execution without exception. Joan was brought before the court one final time, and when asked why she had resumed wearing men's clothing, she told them simply that the voices had returned, that they had told her she had done wrong to recant, that she must remain faithful to the truth no matter the cost. It was a death sentence, and Joan knew it. But she could not live with the lie. She would rather burn than betray the voices that had carried her from the fields of Domremy to the throne room of kings. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led from her cell for the last time. It was early morning, the city of Rouen still waking, the sky a pale wash of gray that promised neither rain nor sunshine. She had been given a simple gray dress to wear, the garment of a penitent, and her head had been shaved, a humiliation meant to strip away the last vestiges of her dignity. But as she walked through the narrow streets toward the old market square, surrounded by guards and followed by a growing crowd of curious onlookers, there was something in her bearing that no amount of degradation could diminish. She held her head high, her lips moving in silent prayer, and though her body was weak from months of imprisonment and her face pale with exhaustion, her eyes held a light that made even her captors uncomfortable. She was 19 years old, barely more than a child, and she was walking toward her death with a grace that seemed impossible for someone so young. The square was already filled with people, English soldiers, French collaborators, clergy in their robes, and common folk who had come to witness the spectacle. At the center of the square stood a tall platform, and upon it a stake surrounded by bundled wood and kindling. It was a pyre built for maximum suffering, designed to burn slowly so that the condemned would have time to recant, to beg for mercy, to provide the final humiliation the English so desperately wanted. Joan was led up onto the platform, and a paper crown was placed on her head, inscribed with the words heretic, relapse, apostate, idolater. She was made to stand there while a priest delivered a long sermon, condemning her sins and warning the crowd about the dangers of deviating from church doctrine. Joan listened in silence, her hands clasped in front of her, and when the priest finished, she asked if she might have a cross to hold. A soldier, moved by some impulse he could not name, broke 2 sticks of wood and bound them together in the shape of a crude cross. He handed it to Joan, and she clutched it to her chest as though it were the most precious thing in the world. She also asked for a proper crucifix from the nearby church, and one was brought, a processional cross that she kissed and held close. The executioner approached her then, his face hidden beneath a hood, and he bound her to the stake with heavy chains. His hands, witnesses later said, were shaking. He had burned heretics before, had watched them scream and beg and curse, but this girl was different. She was praying. She was calm. And as he stepped back to light the fire, he found himself whispering an apology she could not hear. The kindling was lit, and smoke began to rise, curling upward in thin wisps that quickly thickened into choking clouds. The flames caught, spreading through the dry wood with terrifying speed, and within moments, Joan was surrounded by fire. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding and suffocating, and yet witnesses who stood closest to the pyre swore that they heard her voice, clear and strong, calling out the name of Jesus again and again. She did not scream. She did not curse her accusers or beg for mercy. She prayed, her voice rising above the roar of the flames, and she held the crude wooden cross against her chest until the fire consumed it. Some in the crowd began to weep. Others turned away, unable to watch. Even English soldiers, hardened by years of war, found themselves disturbed by the sight of this girl burning for crimes that seemed, in that moment, less like sins and more like acts of extraordinary faith. As the flames rose higher, engulfing her completely, Joan's voice finally faltered. Her body, racked by unimaginable pain, slumped against the chains, and the cross fell from her hands into the fire below. An English soldier who had been particularly vocal in his hatred of her stood near the platform, and as the smoke cleared for a moment, he claimed to have seen something that haunted him for the rest of his life, a white dove rising from the flames, ascending into the sky. Others said they saw the name Jesus appear in the smoke, formed by the patterns of ash and ember. Whether these visions were real or the products of guilty consciences, they spread through the crowd, and by the time Joan's body had been reduced to ash and bone, the mood in the square had shifted from triumph to unease. The executioner himself, once the fire had burned down, wept openly and told anyone who would listen that he feared he had burned a saint. The English, desperate to prevent Joan's remains from becoming relics, ordered that her ashes be gathered and thrown into the Seine River, so that nothing of her would remain, no bone or fragment that could be venerated by the faithful. But they could not erase what she had done, could not undo the victory she had won or the hope she had kindled in the hearts of the French people. Joan was dead, but her legend had only just begun. Within hours, stories were spreading stories of her courage, her faith, her final words. Within days, people were claiming miracles, saying that she had appeared to them in dreams, that her intercession had healed the sick or comforted the grieving. The English had wanted to destroy her, to prove that she was a fraud and a heretic. Instead, they had created a martyr whose memory would burn far brighter than the flames that had consumed her body. In the years that followed, the tide of war continued to shift in France's favor. The English gradually lost their grip on the territories they had occupied. Their armies pushed back across the Channel, their dreams of a unified Anglo-French kingdom dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Charles VII, who had done nothing to save Joan, nevertheless benefited from the legacy she had created. He became a strong king, reclaiming his realm and establishing a stability that had eluded France for generations. But he never forgot the girl who had made it all possible, and perhaps that knowledge haunted him. In 1456, 25 years after Joan's death, a retrial was convened at the request of Joan's mother and at the encouragement of the Pope. The original trial was examined, its corruption and bias laid bare, and Joan was declared innocent of all charges. She was vindicated, her name cleared, her reputation restored. But vindication came too late to save her, too late to give her back the life that had been stolen from her. Joan of Arc died in agony, betrayed by the king she had served, condemned by a church she had loved, and executed by enemies who feared her more in death than they ever had in life. But she died faithful. She died clutching a cross and calling out the name of Jesus. She died with the same courage she had shown on the battlefield, the same certainty she had carried from the fields of Domremy to the throne room of kings. And in dying, she became something more than human, More than a soldier or a saint, she became a symbol of what is possible when ordinary people answer extraordinary calls, when faith triumphs over fear, and when the light of conviction refuses to be extinguished even by the darkest flames. Tonight, as the world grows quiet and sleep begins to claim you, remember Joan, the girl who heard voices, who led armies, who crowned a king, and who died with grace. Remember that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to walk forward despite it. Remember that even the smallest among us can change the course of history if we are willing to listen to the still, small voice that calls us to something greater than ourselves. Joan's story ended in fire, but it began in faith, and it is that faith pure, unshakable, radiant that continues to light the way for all who seek to follow in her footsteps. Centuries after the flames have turned to ash and the ash has been scattered to the wind. Her body burned, but her spirit endures. Her voice was silenced, but her message echoes still. And as you close your eyes and drift toward sleep, let her courage be your companion. Let her faith be your guide, and let her memory remind you that even in the darkest night, there is always light, if only we are brave enough to seek it and faithful enough to follow where it leads. Rest now, and let the story of Joan of Arc carry you gently into dreams, where heroes never truly die, and where the voices of heaven still whisper to those who have ears to hear. And so we come to the end of Joan's journey, a life that burned bright and brief, like a candle lit in a storm. She was a shepherd's daughter who became a warrior, a peasant who crowned a king, a girl who heard the voice of God and followed it to the very edge of death and beyond. Her story is one of triumph and tragedy, of faith that could move mountains and betrayal that could break hearts. She gave everything, her youth, her freedom, her life, and in return, she received suffering, abandonment, and flames. But Joan would not want us to remember only the tragedy. She would want us to remember the victories, the moments when the impossible became real, when heaven touched earth and miracles walked among mortals. She would want us to remember that ordinary people, armed with nothing but faith and courage, can change the world. She would want us to know that even when the voices fall silent and the darkness closes in, we are never truly alone, that the light we carry within us, the light that was given to us by something far greater than ourselves, can never be fully extinguished. Sleep well, dear listener. Let Joan's story settle over you like a blessing. And when you wake, carry with you the knowledge that courage is not reserved for saints and heroes, but is available to all of us, waiting in the quiet moments when we choose faith over fear, hope over despair, and love over hatred. Good night.